You know, when I think about turning points in history, there are certain moments that just stand out. Moments where the course of a war, a country, or even the world pivots in a completely new direction. And for me, one of those moments has to be the aftermath of the Battle of Kursk in 1943. July 12th, 1943. Imagine this. Fields ripped apart, tanks smoldering, dust and debris everywhere, and yet in the middle of all that chaos, the Soviet Union doesn't just hold the line. No, they hit back, and they hit back hard, in a way that would eventually set the stage for the collapse of Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. So let's rewind a second. Kursk itself is often called the largest tank battle in history, and for good reason. The Germans threw everything at the Soviets, their tanks, their soldiers, their artillery, but they came up short. And when the dust settled, they weren't just beaten, they were reeling. They lost about 500 tanks and 70,000 men. That is staggering. I mean, you can almost feel the shock and disbelief in the German command. And while the Germans were licking their wounds, the Soviet commanders like Zhukov, Vatutin and Rokossovsky weren't twiddling their thumbs. They saw a weakened enemy and they smelled opportunity. Here's the thing. The Soviets didn't just think about one counterattack. No, they planned a whole series of offensives to exploit the German weaknesses. And honestly, its scale is mind-blowing. Operation Kutas in the north and Operation Rumance in the south were being prepared simultaneously. Let's start with Operation Kutas. This offensive was aimed at Orel, where the German 9th Army had been battered at Kursk, but wasn't completely broken. The Soviets decided to throw everything they had at it. Over 1.3 million men, 2,500 tanks and 2,000 aircrafts. It was a massive, well-coordinated strike that showcased the Soviets' ability to move massive amounts of men and material quickly. I can't even begin to imagine the logistics. Moving over 1 million troops, coordinating artillery barrages, making sure tanks and infantry were synchronized. It's insane. And Soviets had learnt their lesson from earlier in the war. Gone were the early blunders and chaos and miscommunication. By 1943, the Red Army had evolved into a force capable of pulling off large-scale complex operations with precision. Operation Kutas kicked off on July 12th, the same day that the dust was still settling in Kursk. The city of Orel was a strategic linchpin. Why? Because it has a railway hub. Whoever controlled Orel could move supplies and troops efficiently, and in war that is everything. So the Soviets started with a massive artillery barrage. Over 3,000 guns and mortars were pounding German positions, and the goal was twofold. First, to destroy as much of the German defences as possible, and second, to mask the sound of the advancing tanks. It was calculated, precise, and terrifyingly effective. As the artillery fire lifted, Soviet armoured and infantry divisions surged forwards. This wasn't just a battle. It was a relentless push through smouldering ruins, close quarters combat, and sheer chaos. And amidst all of this, there are stories that really stick to you. Take Sergeant Yakov Pavlov, for example. He recounted moving through the front lines with his platoon, every step costing blood, every advance paid for with their lives. But he said, "We knew the liberation of Orel would turn the tide in the entire region." That sense of purpose, the understanding that their actions had strategic significance, fueled the Red Army soldiers like nothing else. Then there's the incredible story of Captain Maria Otsitskaya. She had lost her husband to the Germans and decided, in true heroic fashion, to buy a tank herself. She named it Fighting Girlfriend and took it into battle. Can you imagine that? Buying a tank and driving it into the fiercest battles on the Eastern Front. Her bravery and determination became legendary among her commanders, and it's exactly this kind of personal stakes that make these operations feel so vivid. The Soviets weren't just fighting as an army, they were fighting as a people, defending their homes, their families, and their country. By July 26th, the Soviets had surrounded and cut off the German Ninth Army. German forces were in disarray. Casualties were mounting and Soviets were steadily advancing. And just over a week later, by August 5th, Orel was liberated. This was a huge victory, not just in military terms, but psychologically. The Germans had started reconsidering their strategy. They could no longer rely on the same offensive momentum that they had before. Meanwhile, the Soviets had momentum, initiative, and morale all swinging in their favor. It's interesting to think about the tactics that made this possible. See, the Soviets weren't just throwing men and tanks at the Germans. They used deep battle tactics, which meant penetrating deeply into enemy lines to disrupt supply and communication lines. They also used shock tactics, concentrated strikes at the weakest point in the German defences. This combination allowed them to encircle and isolate large numbers of German troops, which is exactly what happened at Orel. But what gets me is imagining the scale of the human experience in all of this. Millions of troops just moving, tanks rolling, artillery pounding, and yet amidst all of it, individuals like Pavlov and Skaya are living these personal stories of bravery, fear, and determination. I think that's what makes history feel alive, when you can picture individual faces among millions, and there's more to consider. The Germans had lost about 200,000 men just in this summer's operations, a huge contrast to the roughly 70,000 casualties that the Soviets took. It was attrition warfare at its most brutal, and the Soviets had started to turn it decisively in their favour. The German army had been perceived as unstoppable up till now, and they suddenly were forced into a defensive posture when they would never fully recover from. You can almost feel the desperation in their communications back to Berlin. The reports from field marshals lamenting the weakness of their armoured units, the core of their offensive strength. Meanwhile, the Soviets, the recapture of Orel wasn't just about a military advantage. It was symbolic. It was proof that the Red Army could defend and fight and reclaim their land. And that symbolism carried immense weight. Soldiers' letters home started to reflect a renewed belief in victory. Captain Ivan Petro wrote, "For the first time, I felt the war could be won. We were no longer just defending, we were claiming back our land." That optimism, that belief, that tide that had turned, it wasn't just morale, it was a tangible shift in the mindset of the Soviet people and soldiers alike. The liberation of Orel also had practical, strategic implications. Securing the city meant controlling a crucial railway hub, which improved logistics for subsequent operations. The Soviets could now move troops, tanks, and supplies more effectively, setting the stage for even larger offensive. And the Germans? They were forced back, disorganized and scrambling. This was the beginning of the unraveling of German strategy on the Eastern Front, and it all started in the aftermath of Kursk and Operation Kutas. It's kind of wild to think about the sheer scale and coordination. Over 1 million troops, thousands of tanks, artillery, planes, all moving in concert. And the human cost? Massive. But the dedication, bravery, and ingenuity on display make it one of the most remarkable moments of the war. And these victories weren't just military. They were deeply personal. They were about people reclaiming their homes, avenging losses, and standing against an enemy that had inflicted immense suffering. That's why I love this story. It's not just about numbers and strategy, it's about the people who made it happen. The soldiers charging forward, the tank commanders like Skaya, the planners like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vatutin, coordinating massive offensives that would change the course of the war. Operation Kutas wasn't just a battle, it was a turning point. The start of a shift that would continue with Operation Rumansv, and eventually propelled the Soviets all the way toward Berlin. When you look at it this way, you start to see the bigger picture. The Soviets had evolved. They had learnt from early mistakes, developed sophisticated tactics, and were now capable of coordinating enormous operations that combined infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. And they weren't just defending. They were taking the fight to the Germans, reclaiming territory and forcing the enemy into a defensive posture that they could never really shake. By the time Orel was liberated, the stage was set. The Soviets had momentum. The Germans were on the back foot, and the Red Army was proving that it could do more than just survive. It could dominate. The human stories from this period, Pavlov, Skaya, Petro, they remind us that this history isn't just dates and maps. It's people, it's courage, it's sacrifice at a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. And that, in essence, is what makes the summer of 1943 so fascinating. Operation Kautos wasn't just a battle, it was a declaration. The Red Army was back, stronger, smarter, and ready to reclaim their land. And for anyone watching this unfold at the time, it must have felt like the beginning of something big. The first real taste of hope that the tide was finally turning on the Eastern Front. Operation Rumance kicked off on August 3rd, 1943 still. The goal was simple, but effectively brutal. Recapture Belgar and Krakow, and tear apart the southern wing of the German forces. But simple is relative here, because executing this operation required the coordination of millions of troops, thousands of tanks, and massive artillery and air support. General Nikolai Vatutin led the Voronezh front, while General Ivan Koniev commanded the steppe front. These guys weren't just sitting on their hands. They had learnt from previous encounters with the Germans. They were ready to apply everything they'd mastered in the north at Orel. The operation began, and as you might expect, with a massive artillery barrage. Over 1,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers ripped through the German positions, turning defensive bunkers and fortifications into rubble. The sheer noise of it, combined with the shaking of the earth, was designed to paralyze the defenders. But beyond the psychological impact, it had a very practical goal: soften the defenses and cover the advance of nearly 2 million Soviet troops. Imagine that, 2 million soldiers moving forward while artillery pounds the enemy, tanks roll and planes bomb from above. The scale of this is almost unimaginable today. Belgar was the first major target, and let me tell you, the fighting there was intense. The Germans had fortified the city, expecting the Soviets to be cautious after Orel, but they were wrong. Soviet tanks, including the legendary T-34s and the heavy KV-1s, rolled forward under the cover of Katyusha rocket launchers. Infantry moved in tandem, using combined arms tactics to overwhelm German positions. By August 5th, Belgar was liberated, but this was just a tick on the map. It was a psychological gut punch to the Germans. Army Group South suddenly realized that Soviets weren't just defending. They were aggressively reclaiming their territory. They were doing it with precision and power, and here's where it gets really fascinating. The Soviets didn't just stop at Belgar. They immediately shifted their focus to Krakow. Urban combat there was next level brutal. We're talking house to house, street to street fighting. Every building could be a sniper's nest, every window a potential death trap. Sergeant Mikhail Petro, a soldier in this operation, later recalled, "Every building was a fortress, every window a sniper's nest, but our resolve was unbreakable. We fought for every inch with blood and fury." That quote alone gives you a sense of what these soldiers were up against, and yet, despite the chaos, the Soviets managed to coordinate their infantry, armor, and snipers to methodically clear minefields and traps left by the retreating Germans. By August 23, Krakow fell into Soviet hands, and just like that, the southern front of the eastern front had been shattered. The Germans were forced into a full retreat, losing massive numbers of troops and equipment, while Soviets consolidated their gains. The liberation of these cities wasn't just about territory. It fundamentally weakened the German army's capacity to mount offensives in the south and forced them to stretch their defenses thin across multiple fronts. It is incredible to see how the Soviets applied what they had learned. Operation Rumance was a masterclass of combined arms warfare. Tanks, infantry, artillery, air power, sappers, they all worked in concert. The Soviets had moved from the desperate defensive actions of 1941 all the way to 1942 to coordinated offensives capable of dictating the entire tempo of the war. And all of this while the Germans were still formidable. They were now on the back foot, reacting to Soviet moves instead of driving the battle themselves. And the human stories during this period are just as gripping as the strategy. Many soldiers were fighting to reclaim their homes or avenge loved ones. You've got people like the legendary sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who had already racked up hundreds of confirmed kills and became a symbol of Soviet tenacity, or countless unsung heroes who cleared mines, repaired tanks under fire, or risked everything to save comrades. The scale of sacrifice was immense, but so was the determination. The impact of these victories went far beyond immediate tactical gains. By August of 1943, the Germans had lost roughly 200,000 troops in the north and tens of thousands more in the south. Their capacity to launch sustained offensives had been shattered, forcing them into a defensive posture that they would never really shake. The Red Army, meanwhile, was growing stronger and smarter and more confident with each operation. They were no longer just surviving. They were dictating the entire pace of the war on the Eastern Front. And let's not forget the strategic implications. The liberation of Krakow and Belgrade meant the Soviets now controlled key transportation and supply hubs. Railways, roads, and industrial areas were back under Soviet control, allowing them to resupply and redeploy with incredible efficiency. This logistical advantage was crucial for the next step of the war, setting the stage for operations that would eventually liberate Belarus, Poland, and ultimately lead to Berlin. What's also fascinating is how these victories changed the international perception of the Soviet Union. Western allies like the United States and the United Kingdom began to see the USSR not just as a nation, but as a major power capable of turning the tide against Hitler. Material support under the Lend-Lease program increased, reflecting growing confidence in Soviet capabilities. And within the Soviet Union itself, morale skyrocketed. Soldiers and civilians alike were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Letters home from the front often expressed a rare optimism that the war could actually be won. But late August, the momentum of the East German front had decisively shifted. The Germans were weakened, their morale damaged, and the Red Army was on the march. The twin victories of Kursk and Rumance weren't just military operations, they were symbolic. They represented the resilience of the Soviet people, the effectiveness of Soviet strategy, and the beginning of a relentless push westward that would continue all the way into Berlin itself. The human cost, of course, was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were killed, captured, or wounded. Soviet casualties were also high, and the civilian toll in liberated areas was enormous. Yet, amidst this tragedy, the heroism was undeniable. The stories of individuals, whether it's a sniper with hundreds of confirmed kills, a tank commander avenging a loved one, or ordinary soldiers fighting under unimaginable conditions, illustrate the incredible human stakes in these operations. And the legacy of these operations didn't end with the war. The Soviets meticulously cultivated the memory of their victories. Monuments, memorials, and Victory Day celebrations all reinforced the narrative of the heroic Soviet Union standing against Nazi aggression. This wasn't just about remembering the past, it was about shaping national identity and pride, ensuring that the sacrifices and the victories of 1943 would be remembered for generations. From a military standpoint, Kursk and Murmansk influenced further Soviet tactics as well. The operation marked a shift from defensive postures to coordinated, large-scale offensives that integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air power seamlessly. The lessons learnt here were applied in subsequent campaigns across Eastern Europe, contributing to the eventual collapse of Nazi Germany. Military historians around the world have studied these battles for decades, and for good reason. They demonstrate the evolution of modern combined arms warfare and strategic planning on a massive scale. The psychological impact was just as significant. For the first time, Soviet soldiers and civilians alike felt that victory was possible. They were no longer just surviving, they were reclaiming their land, pushing back an invader that had brought so much destruction. That shift in mindset, this feeling that the Red Army could not just resist, but triumph, that was critical in sustaining morale and determining the remainder of the war. By the end of 1943, the stage was set for the broader strategic shift that eventually would topple Nazi Germany. The Soviets had regained key territories, inflicted massive losses on the German army, and demonstrated that they could operate offensively with remarkable skill and coordination. The Eastern Front was no longer a static battlefield, it was dynamic, a fluid theatre where the Soviets were increasingly in control. See, when you talk about turning points in World War II, it's hard to overstate the significance in the summer of 1943 with Operation Kursk and Murmansk. They weren't just victories, they were declarations. They signaled that the Red Army was back, stronger and smarter than ever, and the Germans were on the back foot for good. These operations set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the liberation of much of Eastern Europe and ultimately Berlin. It's not just the big picture strategy that's fascinating, it's the human stories. The bravery and the sheer scale of what happened. 2 million soldiers moving across hundreds of miles, coordinating tanks, artillery, and infantry while facing a determined and dangerous enemy. That's almost impossible to wrap your head around today, but it's exactly what happened. And it's those human elements, the fear, the courage, the determination, that really bring history to life. The summer of 1943 was brutal, terrifying and bloody, but it was also the moment when the Red Army began to turn the tide. The victories at Orel, Belga and Krakow were more than just tactical wins. Psychological blows to the Germans, morale boosters for the Soviets, and stepping stones towards the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. And when you think about it in those terms, it's no exaggeration to say that this was the beginning of the end of Hitler's ambitions on the Eastern Front. Operation Kursk and Murmansk stand today as monumental examples of strategy, courage, and resilience. They were not just battles, they were declarations of Soviet strength, turning points that reshaped the course of the war, and stories of heroism that continue to resonate. And as we reflect on them, it's clear that the summer of 1943 was a moment when the Red Army went from being a battered force defending its homeland to a victorious, relentless machine pushing westward, reclaiming its territory, and ultimately Europe. If you enjoyed diving into this incredible chapter of history, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the battles, strategies, and stories that shaped our world. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.